Welcome to Security Token Stories, brought to you by Security Token Academy, the leading educational platform dedicated to covering and facilitating the security token industry. I'm Derek Edward Schloss, Director of Strategy at Security Token Academy. Coming up on today's podcast, we have Douglas Pepe, attorney and partner at Joseph Hage Aaronson. Doug is also an instructor at George Washington School of Law, where he teaches blockchain law and policy, and co-founder at Mango Farm Assets, an asset tokenization platform. Mango Farm Assets provides the tools for individuals and entities to create, store, and maintain blockchain-based assets through a simple web-based interface. Doug, it's great to have you on Security Token Stories. I'm looking forward to this conversation. You're somewhat of a triple threat. You're an attorney and partner at Joseph Hage Aaronson. You're an instructor teaching blockchain law and policy at GW School of Law. And you're also a developer at Mango Farm building asset tokenization software. Thanks for coming on Security Token Stories.
No, thanks, Derek, for having me. I'm really excited to participate in this podcast.
Let's start at the beginning. Before we get into tokenized assets and your work at GW, why don't you start off by talking a bit about where you first heard about blockchain and when and how you started to get involved with the technology?
Sure. So it's kind of a funny story. I have 4 kids, and a couple of them are a little bit into tech, and 2 of them are gamers. They're really into gaming PCs and gaming. So my friend and I, one day we had an idea. Why don't we buy a bunch of parts and teach our kids by experience? Teach our he has 1 kid and I have 2 boys that were really interested in it. Teach them how to build a gaming PC. So we did it. We bought all the parts. I think we went online to Newegg and bought a really high quality GPU. I forget what it was at the time. We sat in a room together and we put together these 2 gaming PCs, and we brought them home. And right around this time, I had been reading a lot about Bitcoin, reading about blockchain, but sort of dabbling, and I had some interest. So I think it was Ethereum. I decided that, hey, I'm going to try using this gaming PC that we had just built to start mining a little bit. So I did, and started mining and enjoying it. And that got me reading a lot more about Ethereum and about Bitcoin and about blockchain. So I started, building mining rigs with my friend. We basically would order them, order the GPUs and put together the rigs as fast as we could, as soon as we got the boxes, and we'd plug them in. And that's really how I started. I started as a miner, and that led to a lot of other interests in blockchain, but sort of a neat way to start. It was with our kids making a gaming PC.
That might be the most wholesome origin story I've heard on the show. This is great.
Yeah, and I really believe in, the notion of decentralization. So it was sort of a great way to start. I think that informed in many ways sort of my approach to blockchain issues.
Douglas, something I've been thinking about a lot recently is the challenge for non-technical attorneys to become acclimated with blockchain and the difficult technology involved. I'm curious how you think about this problem. I guess my questions are, why do you think blockchain has the potential to be so disruptive for the legal profession? And how do you teach and convey this to your law students over at George Washington Law School?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The approach I'm taking to this course at GW, well, let me just back up a little. I'm pretty passionate about blockchain. I like to talk about blockchain. And I've done, before I started teaching at GW, I had been doing some things. Right, I had put together a patent application on a blockchain-based voting system, and had constructed. It's actually a funny story. Put together. I saw all these arbitrage opportunities early on in some of these exchanges that are out there. So I was on vacation with my family, coming back from vacation on the plane, and I started scratching out an arbitrage algorithm on the bags and on the plane. So I have a real interest in blockchain at a lot of different levels: economic, legal, and technological. So I was having lunch with a friend of mine who's a pretty esteemed professor at GW, who I know from my litigation life, my lawyer life, by the name of Professor Steve Salzberg. And we're having lunch up here in New York, and I was talking to him about blockchain. He could hear the passion in my voice, and he just looked at me and said, "I want you to come down and teach it." Down in DC, which is where GW is. So I said, I jumped at the opportunity. I said, okay, I would love to do that. So I put together a syllabus, and the rest is history. So now I'm teaching it, and I have a very, clear focus on what I want the students to learn in this course. I think, it's really hard for lawyers like me who aren't sort of neck deep in the technology to, really understand the nuance of how the law should be applied on a policy basis when you really don't know the tech. So my goal for the course and my real focus for the course is to, give each of the students a pretty solid grounding in the tech. And I don't mean, the cryptography. I talk about the cryptography, but they're not doing math, but they're learning about sort of the essential ingredients in the tech, so that they can, when we talk about the legal issues and we discuss them and analyze them, they're doing it from an informed basis in the tech. It gives them some nuance in the discussion that would be, I think, missing if we just talked about Howey or we talked about, KYC, AML. It gives them a solid grounding in the distinctions between the different technologies that are out there in the blockchain space, so they can approach the law with a bit of nuance. So that's what I'm trying to do at GW.
And I had a chance to go through your syllabus, Doug. You wrote an article last year for Law 360 titled "Are Blockchain Utility Tokens Securities?" And you made that required reading for the class this term, which I thought was great. And I went through and read it. And in that article, you walk through the implications of launching blockchain-based network tokens and kind of their intersection with federal securities laws in the U.S. You covered things like the 33 Securities Act, the Exchange Act, the Howey Test, Dow Report, Ethereum, its Ether token that powers the network, the Hinman speech. I thought you did an excellent job walking through up until that point these tough legal lines between utility and security and some of the other legal issues that you're spotting. This April, the SEC released a new framework for this issue, analyzing whether a digital asset is offered and sold as an investment contract. I'm curious, if you were going to write a part 2 to that article, have your views changed? How do you think about this issue today? And is the guidance we're getting from our legislators and our regulators enough for new projects to feel secure in building technology in this area with confidence?
Yeah, so I think the guidance that has come out of the SEC, the framework, look, any guidance is helpful guidance because it provides information for projects to use to sort of put in the hopper when they're analyzing the legal implications of what they're doing, right? So I think, it's all to the good. When I wrote that article last year, what sort of animated that article was, it's more of a policy approach that I took to the article, which is, I looked at some of these blockchain projects that were prominent at the time and still are, and I thought through the issues for quite a bit of time. I think I wrote the article in about an hour and a half, but I had thought about these issues pretty extensively. And I kept asking myself questions like, this was right around the time of Bill Hinman's speech, which I thought was, excellent guidance. It was an attempt to provide some clarity before clarity had really been, out there. We had the Dow report, a couple of enforcement proceedings. But I thought the speech was good, and it got me thinking, what does decentralization mean in the context of certain projects? What does it mean when you have open source? Anybody can fork open source code if they have enough, people following them. Anybody can fork the code of an open source project if they don't agree with what's being done. So I started to think about those issues. And then it got me into this sort of, what at the time was a hot button issue, which is our, utility tokens securities. And, I really enjoyed thinking about the issue because, I sort of have an approach. It's a policy approach, but, and the courts will ultimately decide. But the approach I took was, our utility tokens, and I'm not talking about sort of, ERC-20 tokens that are basically used as a vehicle to raise money, and then, that don't really have utility. That sort of, I put that in the bucket of sort of the easy cases. And I think I said that in the article, easy cases make easy law. I really wanted to think a little bit about the projects like Ethereum, right? Now, debatable whether Ethereum, ETH itself is a token, putting aside that nomenclature issue. I mean, what is it? And I thought about it, what is it? It's a thing that you use to run programs on basically a decentralized computer. Well, that's, got clear utility. And that utility, sort of doesn't lose its essential character merely because he trades on markets, or even because it's centralized or decentralized. I mean, the example I think I used in the paper, in the article, was arcade game tokens. It's sort of a direct analog. You take a token, you buy it at a centralized cash register, and you put it in the machine, and you can play a game. Well, ETH is pretty much, it's very similar in that you take the token, or whatever you want to call it, and you put it in the Ethereum virtual machine, and you're allowed to run sophisticated computer programs. So anyway, that was the basis. I wanted to sort of come up with policy examples in my mind of why some of the things that were being prominently discussed weren't necessarily, didn't necessarily go to the heart of, from my perspective, go to the heart of, the question whether something is a security. So I wrote that up, and I cited to a case called Foreman, and there's a lot of, sort of back and forth debate over how broadly Foreman extends. And I sort of took the position that in the article, that if something, it truly has utility, and it's not just a means to raise money by using the word utility, that it should be sort of carefully considered under this dichotomy between Howey, which is the classic case for what is an investment contract, and Foreman, which is the classic case for, when something gets used, it's not a security. So you asked me a couple of questions there. I'll try to answer all of them. In terms of whether the framework would change my analysis, sure. I mean, any guidance changes the analysis, and that's a pretty comprehensive set of factors in the framework that projects should and are considering when determining whether they're securities or not. It doesn't change my fundamental policy belief about the distinction between products and securities. And one of the things you asked me about legislators, and it sort of brings to mind, I think, an important issue. There's a big difference between big blockchain projects, projects that rode the sort of the spike in prices in some of these blockchain tokens a couple of years ago, and sort of new innovative projects that are trying to do things now. And I think the more clear guidance that we can get, and I mean clear guidance, not a set of factors, not a set of things that $1,000 or $1,200 an hour lawyer should consider for 3 weeks. I'm more referring to a set of rules. I mean, Bill Hinman's speech was clear in that respect, in that he focused on decentralization. The framework doesn't focus on decentralization, but it focuses on a whole other host of factors. I think for smaller projects, that is, it's difficult. I don't know how small projects can even afford to go through the analysis that's required in any sort of, realistic or detailed way. So that leads me to the legislative issue. I think I wrote a little piece on this. I tend to write out little pieces, for LinkedIn and that sort of thing when I don't have time to write a full-blown piece. But I saw the Token Taxonomy Act, the new iteration in 2009. And while you can debate, at the margins, about particular line items of the text, I think the general thrust of the TTA is a good one, which is to really try to encapsulate what is it that we want, federal regulators to be regulating in the securities context, and distinguish that from sort of the run-of-the-mine, other issues. What do we want to capture? What do we want to put in the bucket? And what do we want to keep out of the bucket and leave to states and other regulatory bodies to deal with? I mean, fraud is punishable just about everywhere. The question is, should it be inside the bucket of the securities laws? So I thought the TTA was a good effort, and is a good effort, to try to draw that line and sort of lay out that taxonomy. So I think it's a good first start. I don't know where it's going to go, but I think the more we have discussions about this, and the more clarity that we can provide to most importantly the smaller blockchain projects, the new ones, the innovative ones, the ones that will spring forth like Bitcoin did and come up with something revolutionary. I think we need to protect and provide a little space to incubate for those types of projects.
Something that I'm taking away from listening to you speak is this tension that exists as laws are applied to these bigger projects and how they're applied to these smaller projects. And I think fundamentally it always comes down to this idea of access, I suppose. And I think this is probably a great transition into the work you're doing at your own blockchain project, Mango Farms. I'd love to talk about the software you're building over there. You're a lawyer, you're a legal instructor, you're also a developer. So I think you're bringing a unique lens to software development in this space. I noticed the tagline on the website for Mango Farms is blockchain assets made easy. So, Douglas, what is Mango Farms and what is the problem you're trying to solve?
So Mango Farm is a project that is designed to do exactly what you just said. And that tagline is in there for a reason. We want to make blockchain assets easy. Similar to the approach I've taken with the legal issues that we just discussed, that smaller projects have, I think, more difficulty gaining access to the type of advice that is required in order to properly analyze some of the securities laws implications and other significant legal issues that arise from blockchain projects. Well, I feel the same way about the tech. Right? Most people can't write an ERC-20 contract. They can't even copy it off of GitHub and run it. Most people can't, code, effectively themselves code a blockchain asset. And one of the areas that I'm most interested in is this direct intersection between the law and the technology. And that my interest really isn't necessarily, in the sort of big securities space. It's in the other kinds of assets, the real world assets, everything from paintings to, basically any tangible asset. How do you tokenize that asset, which may be worth $1,000 or $2,000 or $10,000 or, up to $5-10 million? How do you tokenize that asset? How do you fractionalize that asset? Well, Mango Farm exists basically to allow people who don't have a computer science degree to experiment with, and then ultimately perhaps create a blockchain asset for themselves, and if it's appropriate, fractionalize a real world asset. So that's how this concept got started. Actually, it got started when I did a TEDx talk. Oh boy, it was I think it was February or March of 2018. It was great. It was a talk that I did for a bunch of school students, middle school and high school students and their parents, and nobody in this arena or was an auditorium knew anything about blockchain, and I loved it because what I wanted to do was try to teach blockchain in a way that people who didn't know anything about it could understand. So anyway, I bring it up because there's a slide in there where I was sort of towards the end, and I was talking about future use cases for blockchain. My point was that blockchain isn't limited to just finance and exchange of value like Bitcoin, that there were all of these other use cases out there, and I called them future use cases. Voting systems, chain of title, big data storage, music streaming, all these sorts of things. Well, I didn't know about Ravencoin at the time that I wrote those slides, and I had just learned about it right before I did that TEDx talk. But I had started to get interested in Ravencoin. And as I read more about it, as I read the white paper, as I saw what the Ravencoin project was trying to accomplish, I realized that all of the things that I put on that slide, Ravencoin sort of made it possible in a much simpler way than sort of a generalized. This is like Ethereum, like a generalized computing platform that coders or those who can afford coders could create assets on. So I started really getting interested in Ravencoin, reading a lot about it, learning as much as I could about it. And fast forward, I'd say about 8-9 months. I think it was about September of last year. So my TEDx talk was the prior year. September of last year, I had coded when I was a kid, hadn't coded for years, and I woke up one day and said, I really want to start, putting these ideas, which I've been talking about, or thinking about, I want to put them in practice. So, late at night when my wife and kids were asleep, I started coding, and I coded the first version of Mango Farm. And from that day to this, pretty much the sole focus of the platform is to provide tools to people who don't have computer science degrees so that they can tokenize assets on the blockchain. Everything from, all of those things on the slide to any real world asset to, membership cards to anything else they want to tokenize.
Listening to you speak about Asset tokenization reminds me of a tweet you made recently, and it
Uh-oh.
was, do you ever wonder how the phrase landlord originated? It is a feudal relic. When someone held title to your property and could restrict transfer, they would act as a lord of the property. We still let third parties hold and control our money and our assets today. You know, Doug, I thought this was an interesting tweet, and it reminded me one of the reasons people find Bitcoin and other crypto assets so interesting and compelling is that they have this sovereign value outside of our legacy financial and legal systems, but tokenized real world assets are very much within the reach of our legal system. So I'm curious, what would you tell folks who aren't quite interested by this idea of tokenizing real world assets? Why should they find tokenization so interesting? And why should they be paying attention to how this space develops over time?
Sure. Well, let me first start by saying I'm just learning the ropes with Twitter. So I basically sometimes just tweet what's on my mind.
We all
and that
do.
was one where, a lot of people probably didn't get the connection. But, I used to be really into legal history and sometimes I draw connections that aren't so obvious. But, I saw some article about landlords and it just got me thinking about this notion.
It was a great tweet.
Thanks. And in terms of why should people be interested in this? Well, just like your money, right? Where, if you look at Bitcoin, what is Bitcoin really at its essence? It's the ability, it provides a tool for individuals to transfer value between one person and another without any intermediate trusted third party. So I'm not saying Bitcoin will replace the banking system. I'm saying that if you wish to transact value from peer to peer, you can do so using the Bitcoin platform. And it eliminates a lot of, sort of intermediate inefficiencies in that transaction of value. It democratizes the ability to transact value from person to person across great distances over short spans of time. Well, there are a lot of other assets out there in the world that aren't just pure raw value. Securities is a perfect example, right? I mean, you've got an entire ecosystem. When you own a security, you don't own the security. You own basically an unsecured right to sue the person that does own the security if they refuse to give it to you when you ask them for it. And I think there, in that space and in a lot of other spaces, there are, there's sort of two fundamental things that tokenized real world assets can do. They can eliminate friction and sort of skimming is the wrong phrase, but the inefficiencies that result from intermediaries that are no longer essential to transact in ownership. There's an entire system in the United States of America of county clerk's offices that stamp deeds and stick them in books, and then somebody scans them and they put them on a website, and there's a whole industry surrounding that space. Maybe that system is so entrenched in the United States of America that it would be difficult to change over a short span of time. But there are other nations where they don't have that sort of sophisticated existing system that is a relic. Those countries should and are fractionalize or tokenize their real estate. There are a couple of actual use cases that we're working on right now at Mango Farm that I can't discuss on this podcast, but really, I mean, it provides a lot of value to have the ability to transact without an intermediate third party to transact the actual ownership. Now, you talked about the law. The big difference between transacting value on the Bitcoin blockchain and transacting ownership interests on a blockchain like Ravencoin or like Liquid, which is a second layer solution by Blockstream on the Bitcoin network, which uses sort of a peg system in and out of the system, or even Ravencoin or Ethereum tokens. The blockchain code can't be law when you're talking about a real world asset. Code can supply the system of rules, but the law is still the law. And you need to actually have that, the ownership of that asset locked in to the ownership of the token through a system of legal rules, documentation, contracts, or whatever. So that's one of the interesting things. And one of the reasons I'm so interested in this space is, the question, how do you do that? What is the right way to take a piece of art and, take the ownership of that piece of art and put it on the blockchain, so that you're not talking about a representation. You're talking about the actual ownership. The ownership interest in the artwork is on the blockchain, right? So it got me thinking. I've been thinking about this a lot. I actually went out to Wyoming to talk about this a little bit, and I saw this new bill that Wyoming has come out with, and I've been writing a little bit about it. And I'm interested in that particular aspect of the legal issue, which is, how do you do it? What's the right way to do it? Should we have legal systems and regimes in place that allow it? So my proposal for Wyoming was, why not take, similar to sort of the creation of a corporation or an LLC, like people do all the time in Delaware, have a statutory filing system that allows someone who wants to take a real world asset and lock it to a token on the blockchain to basically go to the Department of State in their state and say, I'd like to do this. Here's my, couple $100. Please give me a document that says this token goes with this asset. And then they upload the token, or upload the document, attach it to their token. And from that day forward, the token represents the ownership interest in the asset. So there are a lot of, I'm a lawyer. I'm also interested in the tech. There are a lot of, sort of interesting issues that arise from this transition. I think it's a sort of a part of a historical transition. The transition from, a world where landlords control and restrict the ability of those who are occupying the land to alienate their interest in the land and transact, which is the old feudal thing that gave rise to that tweet. Sort of draw a line from that day to this, through transaction of value without intermediaries, to transaction of ownership of assets. And I think over time we'll start to see more of an adoption of decentralized, no intermediary systems for people to do these sorts of things. And I really think it's fascinating.
Doug, wrapping up, what are some of the things that people can look forward to in terms of following Mango Farm, and where can they find you to learn more about that project and what you're working on?
Sure. Well, they can find Mango Farm or me at mangofarmassets.com. I'm also, pretty active in some of the, social media, Twitter, Mango Farm Assets. That's me personally. But what can you expect from us? We're doing a lot of interesting, sort of innovative things at Mango Farm, which I love. I sort of consider myself to be the chief innovator at Mango Farm. And look, we've done some neat stuff. We were the first BIP44 compliant wallet on web wallet on Ravencoin. We designed sort of a unique builder system that allows you to build assets on the blockchain, sort of point and click and simple forms. We've got a new version coming out. I designed a method for encrypting, and I open sourced it, a method for encrypting data on the blockchain, so that you can have a public, transaction of value, just like you have with Bitcoin, but have the underlying documentation, the legal documents. Imagine you had a will and you wanted to put your will on the blockchain. Well, you wouldn't want to do that in a public way. So it's a system for and a method for encrypting data that rides with the token on the blockchain. So we're coming up with some interesting new stuff, and we're going to keep doing it. I am really passionate about this, and it's something that I love doing. So I spend a good chunk of my time at night, always late at night, every day. And most weekends working on this stuff, and we will continue.
Douglas, I've really enjoyed this conversation, learning more about your work, Mango Farm, and the stuff that you're teaching at GW School of Law. I love how you're thinking about these problems. Let's keep in touch.
Derek, it's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed being on the podcast. Thank you so much.
That's it for this week's episode of Security Token Stories. For more security token content, visit us online at securitytokenacademy.com. and subscribe to our newsletter, The Security Token Edge, which lands in your mailbox each weekend. You can also keep up with the latest security token news by following us on Twitter, Telegram, YouTube, Facebook, and Medium. Before we go, a big thank you to Security Token Academy's Platinum and Gold corporate members who make this podcast possible. You can learn more about Security Token Academy's corporate members at securitytokenacademy.com. I'm Derek Edward Schloss. From all of us here at Security Token Academy, thanks for listening.
Security Token Academy does not provide investment or legal advice. We are not a registered broker-dealer or investment advisor. Opinions expressed in this podcast are the speaker's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Security Token Academy. More information can be found on our website at securitytokenacademy.com.